Hello, everyone. Welcome to Net Diligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. My name is Heather Osborne, and I'm the Director of Global Events and Programming at Net Diligence, a cyber risk assessment and data breach services company. Net Diligence is pleased to bring our thought-leading content to the virtual space with this new webinar series. Visit our website at www.netdiligence.com to get more information about our upcoming webinars and in-person events. Before we begin, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our virtual Cyber Risk Summit sponsors, particularly Aspen Insurance, our diamond sponsor. I'd also like to thank our 100-plus speakers for bringing their thought leadership to our program. For today's webinar, we will be using the On24 platform. Right now, you should be viewing the On24 dashboard, which shows the live viewing screen. During the webcast, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is slated for approximately 45 minutes, with 15 minutes at the end for questions. Our panel of speakers will be taking questions throughout the session via the Questions widget. Please type in questions during the presentation and click Submit. If your question is of immediate import or concerns technical problems, you will receive an immediate answer by text. You can also find a widget entitled Resources, where you can download assets provided by the speakers and sponsors for each webinar. Just click the resource in the box and it will be automatically downloaded. If you are interested in receiving CLE or CE accreditation for this program, you must stay on for the full duration of the webinar and answer 3 polling questions that will appear during the course of the program. Additionally, please fill out the participant information questions. This will ensure that you are correctly matched to the state and professional organization. As a reminder, this webcast is being recorded. After the presentation, you will receive an archive link for further review or for sharing. The webinar will also be available for future viewing on our website. Again, thank you for joining the Net Diligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good morning and welcome to the Cyber Risk Summit panel on evolution of ransomware claims. I'm Richard Goldberg from Brisbois. I'm your moderator. And because I needed to assemble people who really knew about this, we have an incredibly accomplished panel. Kimberly from Beazley, Ben Auton from SpearTip, Matthew Webb from Hiscox, and Bill Siegel from Coveware. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves because they're impressive. I will just tell you that I'm a partner at Brisbois in the Data Privacy and Cybersecurity section. I'm the vice chair of that section. And before I came to this job, I was a federal prosecutor for almost 30 years in the cybercrime section of DOJ. The entire time there was such a section of DOJ. And I'm happy to have joined an industry that is working very hard to protect victims of cybercrime. And I'll pass it over to Kim at this point.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Horn. I'm the Global Claims Team Leader for Cyber and Tech Claims at Beazley. I've been at Beazley for about 10 years, and prior to joining Beazley, I was a litigator for 8.5 years in New York City.
And Ben?
Hi, this is Ben with SpearTip. I'm Vice President of Operations at SpearTip. At SpearTip, we help our partners through proactive and reactive cybersecurity services. My background is malware reverse engineering and forensics.
Thanks. Matt?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Webb from Hiscox. I'm the line underwriter for cyber, which means I look after all the business we write through Lloyd's of London. So our typical clients are large sort of Fortune 500 companies or companies with revenues above $1 billion. I'm also the chair for the LMA Cyber Business Panel, which looks after the interests of the various markets that write cyber through Lloyd's.
Thanks, Matthew. And Bill?
Hi, this is Bill Siegel, CEO and co-founder of Coveware. And prior to founding Coveware about 2 years ago, I was a CFO of Security Scorecard.
Great. Thank you all for being here. Obviously, eminently qualified to discuss these issues. And we're going to lead you right off with a poll question for the audience. The average ransomware payment in the last 12 months was less than 100,000, between 100,000 and 500,000, greater than 500,000, greater than $1 million. So submit your answers and contemplate the fact that you can cross a border without worrying about getting arrested. Okay. So let's jump right in. Here's the agenda for this session. We have really attempted to capture in this presentation the change that appears to be happening in ransomware attacks, the shifting focus that the attackers seem to have beyond the traditional sensitive information, PII, PHI model, and what that does on both the claim side and the underwriting side, and of course risk management, because we may have been focused in one direction, but the attackers may be moving to a different direction. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to ask Ben if he can lead us through some of the changes that he is seeing as they're doing forensics.
Yeah, great, thanks. As far, as the cyber ransomware community has gone, we've continued to see just different evolutions and different levels of sophistication. Over the last several years, from about 2013 on, we've just noticed that ransomware has been getting much more commoditized. We're seeing, just an increase in the level of, coding and effort put into the malware programs themselves. And we're also seeing them being designed to attack security products in order to evade existing security controls. Some of the shift we're also seeing is that other groups who may not necessarily reside in Eastern Europe have started entering the space. Some of the more concerning developments have really been surrounding things like Python-based ransomware, other types of techniques that our security and technical controls just aren't aimed at detecting. And overall, we're really finding that these groups are attempting to make the ransomware more painful. And they're doing this one of two ways. One way is with data exfiltration, and even smaller groups have started entering this space. And then other ways are being more disruptive when encryption actually happens. One example of that is the Black Kingdom group, where not only are they locking files on the file system, they're also hijacking web browsers, so you can't use the web browser after it's been attacked by the group. And we just really see that this increase in pain is also correlating to, increases in ransom demands. And they're just trying to increase that urgency from the client perspective, or the person who is attacked perspective, to actually go ahead and pay the ransom.
Ben, you talked at an earlier point in our discussions about how some of these operators are less competent. Can you talk about that? Because you make it sound like they've become masterminds, but you've also seen the other trend, which is a lack of competence.
Yeah, that is true, where we have seen some types of ransomware where the encryption is sloppy, where the software design is sloppy to the point that it actually damages sophisticated systems that it encrypts. So if you have some sort of large SQL database and you're attacked by one of these groups, you see, even after you decrypt it, just things that are difficult with recovery that require manual rebuilding. And some of the groups we're seeing just outside of the normal groups, you have all the big ones like Ryuk, Sodinokibi, some of these larger, ransomware groups that have kind of set up that, ransomware supply chain, so to speak. If they're not in those groups, usually they're trying to download these things or buy these things cheaply, and it can always lead to problems.
And is that because this stuff is for sale now?
Yeah, we have definitely seen an increase on the dark web, or even some of the hacking forums, where ransomware as a service has started to continue to increase. And, you know, we've seen this before earlier this year with selling access to different environments, different groups collaborating with each other. But at this stage, not only are exploit kits for sale, but full ransomware stacks you can buy. There's even someone running around who actually will fix bugs in your ransomware software for you, and that's what they seem to do full time.
Okay. So let's talk about the trends in ransom itself, and I think, Bill, maybe this is a time for you to speak to that.
So what we've seen, and I'm sure our panelists here and listeners and viewers today have observed, is that, you know, over the past year and a half or so, the size of the ransom demands and a lot of the ransoms that are paid has increased precipitously. And from our perspective, it's been a function of a couple of variables. Most notably, ransomware really is no longer a thing that, you know, impacts networks from the outside in. It's no longer, you know, the user clicks the bad link and their local machine gets encrypted and maybe it crawls into a couple file shares, but that's it. These are now, you know, much more targeted, much more sophisticated attacks where, you know, the threat actors are getting inside the network. They're spending time surveilling. They're turning off all the systems that would otherwise alert the company to their presence. They're wiping and disabling backups, and then at the opportune time, they're attempting to encrypt as many endpoints as possible to, as most effectively as possible, cripple the company so that they can extract as large a payment as possible. And this is really just a function of the overall economics of this sort of crime. The threat actors are expending more energy and resources themselves, and accordingly they're going after larger payouts, just like any, you know, rational economic actor would running an enterprise. And so that's translated into larger attacks, larger companies getting attacked, and an overall increase in the volume of attacks because the market is in disequilibrium. And it's a profitable activity, so you can expect more actors to flow into it.
And are you also seeing that among the more actors, as Ben mentioned, you have some less competent actors, so that you have keys that don't work or aren't delivered or re-extortion?
Yeah, so I think what we'll see probably by the end of the second quarter is that the concentration of, say, the top 3 types of ransomwares will get diluted, and that's because there's these other lower grade ransomware as a service types that are now starting to proliferate. Again, as this market is kind of is in disequilibrium, and as what we suspect is the effects of the pandemic and global unemployment are tipping more people into the activity of cybercrime, and those new entrants are greeted with this plethora of, you know, free new tools that make it extremely easy to pull off a ransomware attack. And they're not getting access to the name brand type of ransomware that the sophisticated actors use. They're getting access to these new kits, as Ben mentioned, that are kind of junky and don't work well, and then you've got an amateur actor on top of it using it, and the end result is worse outcomes.
Yeah,
Ben, anything? Yeah, go ahead.
On the trend side of things, from our perspective, yeah, that's what we've observed in terms of the evolution over the last few years. In that, you know, 2013 to 2018, 17, 18, it was the spray pay sort of commoditized ransomware that then adapted to the big game hunting that Bill explained there. And then now, as of sort of December 2019, we're looking at big game hunting plus the exfiltration of data. And so you're essentially, from an underwriting perspective and from a claims perspective, fusing together 2 causes of loss, but adding one one loss cost onto the other, so the severity is increasing there. I'd also add, just on the trend side of things, I think historically we haven't seen large organisations impacted by ransomware. I think when big game hunting became a thing, or more of a thing last year, we saw the mid-market companies in the sort of 100 million plus bracket getting hit, where you had pretty lucrative targets that didn't always have the best controls and systems in place. But now you've kind of seen big game hunting on steroids, I guess, because we never really saw the S&P 500 being hit. So I guess these are like the woolly mammoths of the big game hunting. But we've seen two in the press this year that have been hit. So one IT firm and one in financial services. So that's an interesting development for us as well.
So let's talk about the attack vector itself, and maybe Ben and Bill, you could speak to this. Ben?
Yeah, we continue to see some of the same attack vectors over the last couple of years. You can see some of the trend lines there that definitely show that RDP compromises and email phishing is definitely something that is highly prized. We saw a lot of people when they were moving to more of a remote posture open up RDP. So from what we were seeing, we saw a bit of a spike just from, opening remote access in an inappropriate way. And some of the software vulnerabilities continue to, exist in a way that allows them to enter the environment. But by and large, those two are the leading attack vectors.
Okay.
Yeah, from B's perspective, as we expected to see with the pandemic, hackers are exploiting the pandemic by disguising phishing emails as COVID-19 alerts and updates, and increasingly taking advantage of the remote desktop protocol vulnerabilities as we see worldwide reliance on remote working. That was somewhat expected, and hopefully folks out there, risk managers out there, are taking messages back to their internal IT staff, warning them about these exploits, because those are the number one, at least from what we're seeing, the number one threat vectors, 1 and 2, that we're seeing in terms of more recent ransomware and even business email compromise events.
So at the same time, thank you, Kim, at the same time, they're not always getting it right, correct?
Yeah, so this is Bill at Coveware. What we're definitely seeing is some of these groups, the more sophisticated ones, are actually getting so large that their own organizational structure and communication skills inside their organizations are breaking down. And that too can lead to bad outcomes, because in the case of some groups, you've got one person or a small group that's actually doing the infiltration to the company. You've got a different group that is staging and exfiltrating data, maybe a third that handles the actual encryption, and then you've got a totally different person that's charged with any semblance of a negotiation. And then you might have a different group of people that are actually the decision makers. And so there's ample opportunity for mistakes to be made, communication mishaps to happen, and for that to negatively impact the outcome of a given incident.
And this slide is an example of that, although I question whether they're not running their own little disinformation strategy as they're negotiating with us for a ransom amount.
It's entirely possible. We've certainly seen this group and other groups admit to mistakes in communications after data was accidentally posted when it wasn't supposed to, data was deleted before it was supposed to, or decryption keys were not delivered because of some mishap in communications.
And finally, closing up the discussion of the technical developments here, can you talk about this ransomware as a service model and how it works?
Sure. So ransomware as a service is essentially an affiliate structure, almost like multi-level marketing, where you've got a developer that essentially owns the ransomware code base. And rather than that single developer going out and carrying out attacks on their own, where they would presumably collect 100% of whatever extortion proceeds they garner, they recruit a network of other individuals or affiliates that distribute the ransomware themselves. And then there's an affiliate developer split, something 70-30, 30% going to the developer. They control the decryption keys, but they rely on their affiliates to actually go out and carry out the attacks. And so it's a method for the developer to do less work for more money and essentially build out their criminal extortion enterprise.
And Ben, anything else you want to add there?
I was just gonna ask
Matthew.
I know Coveware put some good stats together around different gangs targeting different sides of organisations, and I wondered, something that we've seen as well is where someone is using ransomware as a service, actually they're more likely to be hit by a Sodinocoby type strain or variant, and the company is likely to be smaller in sort of employee numbers, and they're going after the lower hanging fruit maybe because there's sort of less sophistication of the gang.
Yeah, so there's the personality of the the developer that runs the ransomware as a service kind of predicates how it will be distributed and who's allowed in. So, for instance, at the very low end, pretty much anybody can become a Dharma or Phobos affiliate. There's no barriers to entry. You can get the kit for free, and if you're successful, you can make a little bit of money. And there are likely hundreds, if not thousands, of individual Dharma and Phobos affiliates out there. On the other end of the spectrum, if you look at Sodinocoby or ReEvil, research suggests that there's probably only 1 or 2 dozen affiliates involved, and they're very selective about who they allow in to use their ransomware because they want to establish kind of a brand and a type and a pattern of the type and size and impact of attacks that they pull off, and they're not really interested in the more pedestrian, hitting the local dentist office type of attacks. They want to be in the press.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the brand side of things as well, because I think on this slide, the thing that sticks out to me, I don't spend that much time, if any, on the dark web, but just with the screenshot here, and you can see, the individual has been designated a level 1, 21 positive reviews, and has, 147 other products up for grabs as well. It's eye-opening how similar that is to, the sites that you visit to buy your groceries or other goods in the more legitimate world.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, the more viewers of this presentation and folks that work in this industry view cyber extortion as its own industry, where economics are really the most effective power laws, the more you kind of come to understand the behavior and the actions that these groups take, because it really does, at the end of the day, predicate how most of these people and groups behave. They bend to the laws of economics.
Ben, anything else?
Yeah, I would just say that Matthew makes a great point on the reviews of the developers, and just from some of the internal communications, we're seeing that the more ransomware as a service rises, the more opportunity those developers have to do to make their tools better. Obviously, managing reputation is important to them to be able to continue to operate. So based on what we're seeing, it's actually a benefit to ransomware developers, not only from an economic perspective, but also from the ability to spread it out, see where the tool fails, see where it's successful, and improve its ability to conduct those attacks.
So now we have another poll question for you. I could ask you, how do you pronounce Sodanakibi, but I don't know how we judge that. True or false, ransomware is estimated to have caused global damage costing organizations $11.5 billion in 2019. Okay, now we're going to talk about the kind of shifting of the model and how the targets seem to be moving as well. Kim, is that what you're seeing?
Yes, certainly. I mean, you know, in the early days, as Bill mentioned, where we had ransomware hitting sort of from the outside in, where companies, there wasn't necessarily a data breach, right? But now we've moved into a scenario where the ransomers are getting into the system, they're capturing data, they're likely capturing all the data they used to, right, when they were just doing a data breach, which is PHI and PII, and they're likely selling that data on the dark web before they are locking down the systems with the actual ransomware. But now what they're doing is shifting the model to try to ensure a payment, which is, you know, threatening to release or publicly release data that has been stolen. And typically, the data that's been stolen that they are holding for ransom in terms of the threat to release is not necessarily PHI or PII. Most companies know they're going to have an obligation to notify people about that information being exposed anyway. And so what they're doing is instead finding product development information, finding corporate secrets, finding information that could be potentially embarrassing about a company's clients, finding litigation strategy and secrets, expert reports. And these are things that are very sensitive to a company, and it's providing a lot of leverage for the bad actors to include as part of the ransom demand. And I'm assuming that's what, you know, Bill and everyone else is seeing as well.
Yeah, we've definitely seen. Sorry, yeah, we've definitely seen similar. You know, it feels as though you know, there's an acknowledgement that the large-scale exfiltration is tricky and a bit of a different skill set for the typical ransomware. And so there's a lot more targeting of data that's likely to compel the victim to pay the ransom. So, you know, as you mentioned, your IP, your patents, your trade secrets, that kind of thing, rather than sort of your mass data breaches like we've been more familiar with in the past in the cyber insurance side of things.
And Tim, I assume that it creates a sometimes difficult coverage question if you don't have the typical PHI, PII exfiltration question. You're dealing with really more of a trade secrets problem.
That could be possible under certain policies, potentially. You know, we always have to look at the facts associated with the scenario and then assess coverage accordingly. I mean, one of the things that has created some coverage issues is the MSP situation. So not data itself, but the type of attacks and the attacks that are launched against managed service providers. So, you know, there are very unique circumstances in those MSP attacks, which right off the bat, you know, presents some issues because you have potentially an MSP having both first and third party liability, and we're seeing really two things. So, you know, they have to deal with their own cyber extortion, their own data restoration, their own business income loss, their own breach response costs, as well as needing to get their clients back up and running and facing potential liability with not being able to fill their service agreements with their clients. And the two key things that come up there are, one, what we find is MSPs are typically not buying enough insurance to cover them for all of these losses associated with the events. They many times have one policy for both, their cyber first-party losses and their liability. And usually those policies are not don't have significant limits, and that creates some issues for them. And two, there's a lot of education that still needs to be done because a lot of MSPs don't appreciate that their cyber policy is not designed to cover first-party costs for their clients. So while if the MSP and their clients are both hit by the ransomware and locked down, an MSP's policy would cover the cyber extortion against the MSP, but it's not going to cover cyber extortion payments that are made on behalf of buying a decryptor to unlock their clients. And most MSPs don't understand that. They don't appreciate that costs associated with restoring their clients' data are not going to be covered under their policy. Their clients would need to have a policy and trigger that policy. And then, of course, costs associated whether their clients had a data breach, again, are first-party costs that are the client's first-party costs, not the MSP's first-party costs. So I think, there's definitely coverage issues that come into play there, and we see those on a regular basis.
I've also seen that in many of these hosting agreements, there is a data preservation obligation on both sides of the agreement. So the MSP and the client have an obligation to keep the data so that when one of these incidents happens, there's fault on both sides. And now everybody's angry at everybody. Everybody thinks that it's clearly the other party's fault. And you have endless finger pointing and potential for litigation. And presumably the coverage question comes up, where is the insurance company going to be in all of this? And how hard do they want to fight this? At least that's what I have assumed is a question that occurs, Kim, but is it?
Well, I mean, the coverage issues are exactly kind of what I outlined, which is that, typically cyber extortion is coverage for your own computer systems being locked down, and data restoration is the restoration of your own data. And what's unique about MSPs is the very nature of what they do is they're an outsourced IT resource for our client. So the client, assumes that they're going to get, that the MSP is going to be the one to get them back up and running. The MSP typically is controlling their backups. So again, if the MSP's hit, the whole, all the keys to the kingdom are in the same place, right? The people that they need to help them get back up and running are down and scrambling to get potentially hundreds of other clients and themselves back up. They don't have enough manpower in order to be able to do that, and we see issues with trying to prioritize clients. And then if the MSP's network has been hit, which houses backups for their clients, and the backups have been hit, the clients really have no means to restore. And so probably one of the good risk management takeaways for clients of MSPs is to make sure they're keeping their backups separate and apart from the managed service provider, because you're just increasing your inability to get back up and running if you're just relying on them 100% for all potential services as you try to get back up and running.
So not all groups are the same, obviously. So Ben, we've got 3 groups on the slide here. Is this really the universe of exfiltrators?
They are definitely some of the more successful exfiltrators, when it occurs. One of the things that we find interesting about data exfiltration is that in the cases where data is threatened that it was exfiltrated, it only was, remotely successful about 60% of the time. We're seeing cases where, some of these groups are threatening to release data, and maybe they were able to compromise a single email address or provide some sort of proof, but in reality, for whatever reason, they weren't able to actually take some of the sensitive things that they're posturing to. But I would say that, those 3 groups have continued to become pretty effective at, stealing the right type of data as the panel was referencing earlier.
So you're seeing a fair amount of bluffing?
Yeah, we do see a decent amount of bluffing, and once we're able to go in and do some of that forensic investigations and really dig into the data, I think it's important when being threatened with data exfiltration to actually validate what the true scope of the exfiltration might have been. In a few of our cases, it really helped ensure that the ransom demand, stayed at a much more reasonable level after the client was able to call the bluff of the bad actor.
Mm-hmm. And what is I'm sure it's much more difficult when you're trying to do forensics involving an MSP.
Yeah, I mean, certainly MSP environments are some of the more complicated environments. In many cases, just because how an MSP is incentivized, they're focused primarily on availability, which means that in some, internal environments, there's a little bit more balance between technical security controls and some of what the IT availability looks like. For MSPs, it's kind of heavily slanted toward being, readily available, easy to use, which causes them to do things in a way that can make recovery pretty exceptionally challenging, even when you go through some sort of payment for a decryptor.
Bill, how about on the negotiation front? What challenges arise from MSP attacks?
Yeah, I think that. Oh, sorry.
Sure. So on the negotiation side, a lot of the challenges can really arise on the number of parties that are potentially involved, all with a somewhat common goal, but sometimes competing interests, and certainly competing budgets or capacities to pay or resources available. The threat actors in these cases tend to want to extract a very large number to essentially decrypt all of the impacted downstream clients of the managed service provider, and they tend to want to only negotiate with the managed service provider accordingly, or with a single downstream client that's willing to pay for everything. And so you can imagine the kind of cobweb of issues that can result when you've got a bunch of different groups all experiencing different levels of inoperability as a result of the attack, that all need to get coordinated and try and work towards a good common outcome in a short period of time.
You've got to get stuck in the middle sometime also between companies that want to be restored individually, or they want somebody else to pay for it, or they want a better deal than somebody else is getting.
Yep, there's no shortage of conflicts that can arise in these sorts of matters. It can be very difficult to get everybody aligned and working together towards a common outcome, and it's not uncommon for certain groups to be marginalized, or for the threat actor to receive multiple payments sometimes because there's a lack of coordination among the the multiple different victims that are impacted.
And Kim, I assume that also extends the insurance level, because you'd rather have somebody else pay the bill.
No, I mean, I think it goes back to what I said before, which is, the insurance is only going to foot the bill for the insured and not for the clients, because it has to be tied to which computer system has been locked down. And so, once we get over the hurdle of explaining that reality to insureds, we're happy for them to pay for a global decryptor. And then once we understand how many folks they've paid, to decrypt, we can pay based on an allocation. Certainly, if any of the clients have their own cyber insurance, or K&R insurance, for example, there may be other mechanisms for recovery. But the cyber policy is only going to pick up the cyber extortion for their insured, not on behalf of others.
Kim, do you see MSPs coming in and buying tech E&O cover with their cyber policy and looking for sort of recourse under the tech E&O to sort of prevent claims from their customers that are affected by the ransomware incident?
We certainly see folks with E&O cover making arguments that making the payment on behalf of their client would mitigate their loss. The tricky aspect to that is that they likely have a service level agreement that has a limitation of liability clause, and oftentimes what they're willing to pay on behalf of a decryptor for their client far exceeds what their limitation of liability would be under their contract. We have to look at those all on an individual basis.
Yeah, I think, and that's what we've seen as well, is that where we've insured clients of MSPs who have suffered as a result of a ransomware intrusion at the MSP level, it's kind of a mixed case of subrogation. Sometimes it's been successful, but other times not, for exactly the reasons you mentioned there. Right.
Yeah, it's really a case analysis. I mean, you don't want to see an insured unnecessarily be sued, but technically to trigger their E&O policy, a claim needs to be made against them, which is demand for money or services. So we do have to look at all that on a case-by-case basis. But at the end of the day, the policy would only reimburse them in that situation for what they're legally obligated to pay.
And I have also seen where the attackers think they know more about what's going on at the particular victim than is actually happening. So they've been in the email system, they may have even seen reference to coverage, or they've found a file marked insurance coverage, and they think they understand how the coverages work, and they calculate the ransom demand based on the insurance coverage they think that's there. And of course, maybe their English isn't so good, or maybe they're not actually coverage attorneys, so they don't, understand. And some of the ransom demands have just been insane. Small companies hit with $25 million demands because the attacker thinks that their analysis of the insurance coverage is correct. And they have made mistakes, and they've misinterpreted the policy, and that's kind of become clear in the course of the negotiation. These are examples. I don't know where these came from. Is this Bill or Ben?
Yeah, so these are just some examples of what we call the worst moment on a really bad day, when it becomes clear that the threat actor has actually found policy documentation, and so they understand the limits of the policy and are now using it against the victim in the negotiation. So as everyone can probably imagine, this is arguably the worst position to be in from a cost reduction and a negotiation perspective. It makes a lot of the narratives that work kind of null and void, and makes it very difficult to reduce the amount of the demand.
Yeah, and so we've seen several situations where this has happened, where it's clear the bad actors have accessed the cyber insurance policy, the demands commensurate with the aggregate policy limit, and when you look at the size and financial wherewithal of the company, it doesn't match at all. And, they just think from the bad actor's perspective that insurance is going to foot the bill, so they don't appreciate that that's not necessarily true, right? Because there could be a factual scenario where coverage is barred, some of the examples we talked about. There could be a sublimit to the cyber extortion coverage, so the entire policy limit's not actually available for them for payment of the ransom. And then, of course, the insured is going to need to pay, rely on the policy to pay for a host of different other costs, whether it be data restoration, their business income loss, their breach investigation, the third-party liability that inevitably flows from these events. So they're not going to want to blow their entire policy limit on just paying for the ransom. And so even though we've seen the link between the policy and the demand, we've still been successful in some cases of negotiating that down, although I feel, in some of the cases, we're still paying a lot more than we would have given the size of the company had they not had access to the policy, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. So, Matthew, how do you underwrite all this? I mean, I don't know how you predict where the tactics are going next, but that's the art of it, I guess. But given what you've seen and what we've talked about, how do you underwrite this?
Yeah, well, clearly it's a very, very difficult job, Rich. Thanks for highlighting that. I think I'll rattle through the next few slides here. I think ultimately, on the next slide, data is king, and really at the moment we're looking at attacks that are causing issues from December 2019. It's not like we're looking back at weather patterns over centuries, or we can pull hard data on security class actions to derive a frequency for things like D&I. So the key thing is to act as data detectives, really, and gather as much intel as possible, whilst not getting too bogged down in the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so really we look at three sort of headline areas. So what we want to understand is what's the overall performance of the market from a frequency and severity standpoint. I mentioned the S&P 500 earlier. How frequent are events in there? And you look at other things. Hiscox released their cyber readiness report this week, and that's a report that contains a survey from 5,500 companies. 350 of those had paid a ransom in the last 12 months. So that's 16% of all firms in that cohort. So it's interesting. The other area is to look at severity. I think there's a lot of reports in and around that. So you see Crypsys talk about the average ransomware demand increasing fivefold, with the stats from Coveware earlier. But really what you want to try to derive is what is the frequency and severity that exists within the overall market, and make inflationary increases where you don't have complete data. You then move on to talk about things like the trends that you can spot. So what are the positive and negative risk factors that should be considered? What does my claims data tell me about certain industry sectors? What do the likes of Coveware, Kivu, Crypsys tell me about industries that are being targeted? And you can draw trends from those. The domicile of the insured is also interesting. I think the overwhelming volume of those doxing, data exfiltration attacks are happening against US companies. And our own data shows that ransomware attacks in the US cost 22 more times than ransomware cost in Germany. And then you move on to the next slide, and we look at things like risk ceiling pricing. And the questions here are based upon the macro information that I know. How do I choose the right risk, and what price should be charged? And there's many, many questions that you can ask organisations here. I think it's, ultimately you want to look and say, right, this particular company falls into this revenue demographic and it's operating in XYZ sector. So I know that this ransomware variant may be the main threat for them. So if you're looking at something like a riot, then you deep dive into their spear phishing controls. And I think it's a fair question now. Ransomware is such a challenge for us and for organisations, where we used to ask companies to break down their controls using the NIST framework or similar, actually to specifically call this out for ransomware. And you can flow through, identifying the protect and detect, really deep dive onto the tech that they've got. Look at the response in place, look at what the governance is there, and then what the recovery is. And I think just to highlight how useful some of these controls are, the next slide shows that the cost to handle a ransomware can reduce by 75%. I think the 75%. I think the 5% missed off that slide. But you can see it's got a massive reduction there. So you've got the pie chart on the left. where the insured hasn't had a good backup strategy and they're paying the ransom often, versus the slide on the pie chart on the right where it's 0%.
That is amazingly complex. And I don't know how you predict where the industry is going next. In my industry, I mean the ransomware industry. And even on this slide where you're talking about backup strategy, you had Kim talking before about how if it's trade secret information, the backup strategy doesn't necessarily matter because it's the data exfiltration that's the problem. You could still have 100% access to your data, and you still have a gigantic problem.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's a really good point because these stats are from last year. That was prior to us observing the exfiltration of the data. So really staying up to date is difficult. I think, we do scrape data on all reported incidents and compile that internally to use that to spot trends. I think that the point you make there on the data exfiltration, it really is a challenge to talk about severity. The one comment I'd make on that is that, you look at the largest sort of reported cost around ransomware last year. You had Norsk Hydro coming in at, $50 to $60 million, and Demand, a Danish hearing aid manufacturer, 90 to 100. This year, you'll see, I think Cognizant have reported in their quarterly trading statements that their ransomware incidents going to cost them 60 to 70 million. I guess the sort of slight solace that I take on that is that, it was a primary 10 issue. It's probably moved to a primary 25 or primary and first excess issue, but there's not shed loads of events that are going with massive severity at the moment, but we keep a watching brief on that.
So this has been an entirely different presentation. So on the off chance that you're invested in Bitcoin, our last polling question, which is top Bitcoin traders expect one Bitcoin to reach what value by Q3 of this year? 8,000, 15,000, who knows? Before we leave, let me just throw it to each of you to see if there's anything that we missed in discussion of any of these topics along the way, or if there's anything inspiring you have to say that makes us think this is going to get any better in the future. Ben, anything from you?
Yeah, I think on the proactive side, we're just hearing about a decent amount of insurance tech that I think is really going to help dig into organizations' risk posture and really help provide some clarity on this issue. Companies like RCO and others, I think that's definitely a bright spot for the industry.
Okay. Bill?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we're going to see the market ebb and flow. It's currently in disequilibrium from our perspective, and I think we're going to see more amateur groups flow in and more pressure put on organizations to fix kind of the low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities so that the economics of these sorts of attacks become less profitable for the cyber criminals. And I think one of the key takeaways is to really think about how to make this activity less economically profitable for the actors. And if you can put pressure on those economics, then the overall activity will become depressed.
Kim, how about from the coverage side?
Well, I think it all comes down to risk management, right? What data do you hold? How robust are your cybersecurity defenses? And how, how planned out is your business continuity procedures? And have you really given thought to, a scenario in which you're down for days, weeks, hours, whatever the case may be, and how quickly you can get back up and running? I don't think companies are doing enough to test those procedures, to test the viability of their backups, to understand how long it's going to take to restore from their backups. And they're certainly not putting the commensurate level of cybersecurity defense as relates to the sensitivity or confidentiality of their data in place. So I think companies really need to take a hard look at that because it's very challenging to keep up with the bad actors. And so, we just need to continue to be looking at our risk management procedures to and help educate folks about what the threats are.
And Matthew, I'm with you.
Yeah, I'd agree wholeheartedly with Kim on the risk management side of things. I'd make two other points. I think, the rating environment from the cyber insurance side of things has moved now, so we are seeing rate increases, and that is predominantly driven from ransomware losses in the market. And I'd say the sort of final point would be, we need lobbying of government, law enforcement, and security agencies on this, I think. It's getting to a point now where it's so prevalent that we need more engagement by those kind of bodies to help, solve the problem.
I wish I thought there was going to be any relief there. I don't see how that's coming to pass in any of the groups you just named. But I found a way to end a hopeful slide in a negative way. So let's hope that somebody asks us some questions that gets us more into an optimistic frame of mind. And I'll now throw it open to questions. So we're back live, this panel, ransomware, and we've had a couple of questions about what's being done to stop ransomware attack groups and what law enforcement is doing, and perhaps also what the insurance industry can do. So Kim, let me ask you, is there anything the insurance industry can do working with law enforcement or other measures that you all might be able to take to limit ransomware?
Sure. So risk management is a huge key, and I know that at Beazley we're very focused on pre-breach and risk management and trying to put the companies we insure in a better cybersecurity posture. I know a lot of other companies are focused on that as well. In terms of law enforcement, there's been some collaboration between law enforcement and the insurance industry. We look forward to keeping the channels of communication open so we can continue to learn about threat factors and how to best protect companies and push some of that information out to our policyholders to better protect them. At the end of the day, companies should work with their privacy counsel and report incidents of ransomware to law enforcement. The more evidence that law enforcement collects from each case, the more progress they'll make ultimately in shutting down these criminal groups.
Yes, and you should know that there is a very broad attempt by the FBI to examine ransomware groups, to identify them, and they are always trying to collect information about that. As somebody who worked at DOJ for a long time trying to catch cyber criminals, you should also know that because a lot of them are located overseas, this has really become a little bit of a State Department issue also. You may be able to identify somebody in a foreign country, and the identification is great. As you can imagine, identifying somebody whose fingers are on the keyboard several thousand miles away is never an easy thing. But assuming you can identify them, it doesn't necessarily mean that the country that they're in is going to immediately put them on a plane and send them back. And it becomes more of a diplomatic issue. But it is something that DOJ has been focused on for at least a couple decades. We've had a lot of good success, and we've had some people who have found places to hide where it's very difficult to get them out of. But I think that the effort is very robust, and the FBI hosts a ransomware conference every year, and insurance is there, forensics is there, legal people are all there. So the effort is ongoing. And thank you all very much for attending this panel. Thanks for all the panelists whose expertise is unparalleled. And it's been great appearing in front of you all. Have a great conference.